Like some of them are really obvious. My wife actually wanted to buy to Italy, when she got the airport open. So when she bids for her flights, she can choose like what she goes. And so she bid thinking she was going to go to Chile, but she actually ends up going to the city. So like she said, no, I'm going to Chile next week. I'm going to the States. I'm not going to Chile. I said, no, you're going to the States. She went, oh, I'm not going to Chile. But it's a bit worrying to buy them, isn't it, when they go? Like, no, there's a sort of story when pilot actually got through to the wrong city. They mixed up, and so the pilot had been given that briefing to learn one place. The passengers still thought they were going somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah, I would think first journey in the world. Something then was sin about. But it's very true. Sin is better to help. So, what is it? I think so. I'd say. Yeah. No, it seems surprisingly few. Yeah. Yesterday, like, few didn't work, and the other few didn't work, so the next few didn't work. It was like.
Wonderful, it's really good to see you guys. We're going to make a start. Great. Yeah, so I just want to give you really a warm welcome to the Search. My name's Josh, I'm from England.
I'm again, not from England, from Nazareth, and I study here.
So the Search is a series of events helping those of us here in Tel Aviv to think about life's big questions, and faith, God, humans, what are we doing here, and all of this. It's hosted by the Fellowship of Christian Students in Israel. This is a group of students. We exist here in Tel Aviv and in campuses across the country, doing exactly this, helping students think about the big questions of life. So if you think about things, you're in the right place.
So now we would like to invite to the stage Michael. Michael is an author and a speaker. He's from England, and he goes all around the world in different countries to help students think about the kind of questions that we're thinking about today. So Michael, how have you been enjoying your stay?
I have really been enjoying it. I arrived yesterday, and so this is my first full day. And I was just saying to some people before this started that I have been to hundreds of universities around the world, but I think the campus here at Tel Aviv University is my favorite campus anywhere in the world. So that's not just because it's sunny, although that does help, doesn't it, when the sun shines. But I love it. It's very relaxing and calm, and I see people sitting under palm trees, reading books, and I'm thinking, like, this would be a really nice place to study. And I think I definitely studied in the wrong place. So if I ever want to do some, like, further study, need to come to Tel Aviv.
Well, we would love to have you.
Thank you.
Yesterday we heard that you applied to the pilot.
Yes.
So we also heard that there's a funny story about how you met. Would you like to tell us?
Well, So my wife is a pilot. We didn't meet on an aeroplane. People always think that because we both travel a lot, although we were both on the same aeroplane, flying to a skiing holiday. So we were both going skiing in Austria. So we met in Austria, not in England. And it was a skiing holiday organized by a Christian organization. So I'd been invited to give some talks to the guests. And I got on very well with one of the guests during the week. But the funny thing was, initially, I wasn't actually thinking in any way about my now wife in that way, because two reasons. Firstly, I'm from England and Rebecca is from Scotland. And Scottish and English people they like to dislike each other. So I thought this could be very awkward when it comes to sports, because Scottish people support two teams, Scotland and whoever is playing England. So I thought I couldn't take this. Secondly, I'm ashamed to say, I knew because I was organising the trip that she was older than me. I didn't know how much older, actually just 3 years older. And so I thought she's Scottish, she's older, no. But that was actually a good thing because it meant that I was completely relaxed. I wasn't actually trying to impress her. And in being myself, we got on really well, which is always a good start to a relationship. So yeah, by the end of the week, I asked her if we could continue to get to know each other better, let's say. There's lots more I could say, but I probably shouldn't.
الحاجة ترجمة في نيويورك طريقة الدوم
And yeah, just before we leave you to it, Michael, just want to highlight that we will have a Q&A time at the end. So you can scan this now and you'll be taken to a website, Slido, where you can submit your questions, or just go to Slido, sli.do, and then put in peace in the kind of code. So yeah, think about those questions, save them for the end, and there'll be plenty of time to talk afterwards also over some sandwiches, some drinks, and 3 books. So yeah, without further ado, Michael.
Great, thanks guys. It's really good to be with you. A big welcome if you are here for the first time. Great that you're with us tonight. As Josh has said, we are going to have questions in about 20 minutes or so. So scan that QR code. It will be up throughout most of the talk. And you can put in your questions. You can vote on other people's questions. And so you can interact in that way. And as I said last night, we are totally happy with any questions. We won't be offended if you disagree. I will be more offended if you didn't ask your question. So please do ask your questions in that way. Now, we may have met some of you today on campus because we were going around your beautiful campus with its palm trees, and we were asking some questions related to the topic. This question was about truth. And so we were asking, is truth important? And is there such thing as absolute truth, or is it all relative? And as you can see, the responses from the University of Tel Aviv is that truth is generally quite important, apart from someone down here. But there's quite a mixture in terms of whether truth is absolute or relative. We're going to come back to that later. So that's very interesting. And then this one, we actually asked 3 questions. Firstly, truth, does it exist or not? And we got a real range right across from people who said there is absolute truth to people who said, no, it's all relative. We then talked about morality, and we said, is there such thing as absolute morality? There was a little bit more saying yes on this, but still a range. And then, is there such thing as inner peace? Well, again, there's a range, but most people were saying yes, there is inner peace. I suggested that if we did this in England when it's raining, perhaps the response on inner peace might be less, because it's always easier to feel inner peace when the sun is shining. But that introduces us to the question of tonight, which is it possible to have peace in a world of competing truth events? As I mentioned last night, for those who were here, I come from Leicester, in the middle of England. It's not as beautiful as Tel Aviv, and we don't have a beach, and the weather isn't nice, but it has 2 things that it is famous for. Firstly, a few years ago, it had a very good football team for 1 year. Okay, they won the Premier League, and everyone was surprised, including myself. The other thing that is interesting about Leicester is that it is very ethnically diverse. In fact, Leicester was the first city in the UK to have an ethnic majority. So the majority of people in my city don't come from a kind of white English background. And so along with that, you have therefore all sorts of different religious systems represented. You've got synagogues and mosques and temples and churches and so on. If you want to find a place of worship, you will find it in Leicester. And generally, there has been a degree of harmony between those ethnic and religious groups, I'm pleased to say. Although more recently, there have been some tensions, some last summer that were more serious. But that isn't always the case, is it? Around the world and through history, we are aware that sometimes different truth claims and different religious truth claims can lead people into conflict. And perhaps we're all very aware of that, aren't we? And therefore, the question is, when you've got different people making different claims about ultimate objective beliefs, how can you have that and not lead to conflict? How can we live in a world where people can hold competing truth claims and yet live in peace with each other? That's the question. I guess there are different responses to this. The first response that some people make is, well, it's impossible, okay? We cannot have peace when we have all of these different truth claims. So what we need to do is just eradicate the truth claims. Did anyone watch Eurovision the other week? Okay. Like Israel's always good at Eurovision. Like I always feel like, anyway, so Eurovision, it was in the UK. Very exciting. We didn't win it, but we still got to host it. And we certainly didn't win it this year. But in the interval in Eurovision, they sang, a number of previous winners from Eurovision sang songs that were inspired by or written by people who came from the same city. And the first song was probably one of the most famous songs, which almost everyone knew, the song Imagine, okay, by John Lennon of the Beatles. And he sings, imagine all the people living life in peace. And it's a real anthem. It's very catchy. It's really, in one sense, beautiful. But in the song, he has these lyrics: imagine no religion, nothing to fight and die for. And so the song basically supposes if we could just get rid of religion, get rid of all of these truth claims, imagine all the people living life in peace. Wouldn't that be a better world to live in? And John Lennon wasn't the only person to make that claim. Certainly back in the UK after the September the 11th attacks, there was a real movement of many people saying, let's just get rid of religion. And certainly some people still think that. Now, what do we make of that? Well, firstly, I have a problem listening to John Lennon telling us to get rid of religion, because in the very same song, he says, imagine a world with no possessions. And I think John Lennon was one of the richest people alive on planet Earth, singing a song about imagining no possessions. So I think maybe there was a degree of hypocrisy behind the lyrics of that song. But also, more seriously, it has been tried. Just look back into the 20th century, and the idea of eradicating religion was certainly behind the thinking of the Soviet system. And this is quite personal to me. My great-grandparents lived in Estonia, which was under Soviet control during periods of the Second World War and then afterwards. And my great-grandparents actually died in Siberia as a result of the Soviet system. And that system basically said, let's eradicate religion. But of course, in eradicating religion, they simply replaced it with another system, maybe an atheistic system, but a system that could cause as much, if not even more, oppression. And so if we get rid of religious truth claims, we can just end up with secular truth claims taking their place. And they're not necessarily any more peaceful, are they? So eradicating religion, I'm not sure, is the answer. Another suggestion that some people make in terms of how we can have peace is to say, well, let's relativize all truth claims. So let's just say that it doesn't really matter what you believe. All beliefs are relative, and ultimately it doesn't really matter. Okay? Now, when I was at school back in England, one of the illustrations that my religion teacher used to love was this illustration. It was the illustration of the elephant. Has anyone come across this illustration? So the story goes like this. There are some blind men, and they are trying to work out what is in front of them. And one of them feels the side of the elephant and says, oh, it must be a brick wall. And one person feels its trunk and says, oh, it must be a pipe. And one person feels its tail and says it must be a rope. And one person feels its ear and says it must be a leaf, and so on. And the illustration basically is given to make this point, that religions are like blind men feeling an elephant. And they are all basically grasping the same reality. And although their claims appear to be contradictory, they're all actually complementary, and it all fits together. And therefore, it doesn't really matter what your individual beliefs are, because ultimate reality is the same. Now, that's really popular, or it was really popular for some people. But again, I would suggest there's at least two problems with that. And the first problem is that actually they weren't all correct, were they? Because it wasn't a brick wall or a pipe or a rope or anything else for that matter. It was an elephant. They were all completely wrong, okay? They weren't kind of getting a little bit of the truth. They hadn't got any of the truth. They were a million miles from the truth. And the second problem is this. Who is it who claims to be able to see the elephant? It is the person giving the illustration. In other words, what they are saying is all the religious people in the world are basically blind, but me, modern secular pluralist, can see what everyone else can't, which is perhaps a little bit arrogant, and is also claiming a truth that is absolute. So maybe that doesn't work in the way that we thought. And actually, in reality, it's difficult, isn't it, to get away from making any kind of truth claims. And all truth claims are by nature, in a sense, absolute. So to give you an example, think of how people think of religion. So basically 4 different views you can have of religion. You could say all the religions in the world are true, every single one of them, including Jedi and all the rest of it, okay? Or you might say, okay, well, not all of them, some of them, maybe let's have the major world religions. Okay, some of the religions in the world are true. Or you could say, no, there's only one, and it is, well, whatever you think. Or, of course, you could say none of them are true. They're all completely wrong. Now, if you say one religion is true, often people will say that's really exclusive. How can you claim that there is only one truth? But actually, all of those views are exclusive, aren't they? Because if you say all religions are true, you think the people that say that some of them, one of them, and none of them are true are wrong. And if you say that some of them are true, you think that those who say that all of them, one of them, and none of them are true are wrong, and so on. So whatever you believe, right, you basically have to disagree with someone. It is impossible not to. Okay, that's the nature of truth and the nature of reality. We can't get away from objective truth claims. And also it's worth saying this. When people say, all truth is relative, or that's nice for you, but personally I have a different opinion, generally, we say that about things that we think don't matter very much. And so if you don't think that God or a spiritual dimension matters to life, then it's kind of easy to say, it doesn't really matter what you believe. But if you think it really does matter and does have eternal significance, then it's a bit different, isn't it? And in life, all of us probably have things that we think are really important. Things where we're not happy to say it doesn't matter what you believe. Okay? An example of this would be, how do we react when people deny something like the Holocaust? Do we say, it doesn't really matter, you're free to have your opinion, all truth is relative anyway? Of course we don't. When we see something like that, we say truth really does matter. And we're not happy to say that everything is relative. So if something is important, then it is not relative. And most of us seem to assume that. So there's a third option that some people suggest, and it's this. How do we have harmony in the world's competing truth claims? Don't eradicate religion. Don't relativize truth claims. The third one is to say, well, let's just hold our truth claims lightly, okay? It's fine to have your beliefs. It is fine to believe that you're right and other people are wrong and that your beliefs are absolute and so on. But just don't make a big thing of it, okay? Just hold it lightly. I remember a while back, quite a while back now in the UK, they were discussing the problem of religious extremism and the potential for violence that was causing within the UK Parliament. And someone was saying the problem is with radicals, they said. We don't want radical religion because of the danger that can cause. But here's the interesting thing. Radical, the word radical relates to the word root. To be a radical means to get back to the root of something. So the question, therefore, is, what is the root of my belief or the truth claim that I claim to follow? And therefore, should I follow that completely or lightly or not at all? And it's very easy to say we should just hold our beliefs more lightly. But it depends what the belief is, doesn't it? So what I want to do just for a few minutes is to suggest that actually when it comes to part of the Christian claim focused on Jesus, I would suggest the answer is not to be less radical, but here's the controversial thing, actually to be more radical, okay? So let's go back to the root. What is Christianity about? It's not ultimately about a philosophy or a system of morality or even an institution. Ultimately, it's about a person. That's the heart of the claim. The clue is in the name, isn't it? It's about Jesus Christ. And what is the truth claim of Jesus Christ? Well, on the one hand, when you look at Jesus' teaching, Jesus makes some really exclusive claims. He says things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father, a way of talking about God, except through me. Which on the surface sounds radical, doesn't it? It's like, what, he's basically saying he is the truth and the only way to know God is through him. Isn't that dangerous? Wouldn't it be dangerous to follow someone who believes stuff like that? And yet, whilst Jesus made such an outrageous and exclusive claim, you also look at the way he responded to people who disagreed with him. It's a really interesting account in Luke's gospel. This is Luke's biography of Jesus' life. And let me just read it to you, because I think this is fascinating in terms of how Jesus responds to those who have different opinions to himself. We read this. As the time approached for him, Jesus, to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. Okay? So Samaritans didn't worship in Jerusalem, they worshipped in a different area, and there was an animosity between the Samaritan people and the Jewish people at that time. When the disciples, James and John, Jesus' followers, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and to destroy them? Okay? They basically think that Jesus might applaud their religious zeal. Here are some people who don't believe in you, Jesus, who don't welcome us, so let's get rid of them, let's destroy them. And I think they were expecting Jesus to give them a pat on the back. Well done for your religious enthusiasm. But Jesus turned and rebuked them. And then he and his disciples went to another village. So Jesus doesn't reward them for their religious zeal and trying to destroy those who don't believe in Jesus. Actually, he rebukes them. He says, actually, I'm not going to let you do what you're suggesting. And interestingly, therefore, Jesus, although he claims to be the truth, doesn't force or impose that truth upon others. He invites people to discover it, but doesn't impose it by force. And that actually is the basis of what we might call religious tolerance. The idea that we can hold to religious belief systems, but you cannot force them upon someone else. Now, partly, as we'll see in a moment, I think that's because at the heart of Jesus' claim is an invitation not to a religion, but into a relationship. And religions, well, in one sense, you might impose a religion upon someone, but you can't impose a relationship, can you? It has to be chosen. If someone chooses to reject it, that is their choice. So how does Jesus respond? He doesn't commend that kind of behavior. But more than that, Jesus doesn't just go around not condemning the people who don't believe in him, but he does something else. Earlier in the same biography of Jesus' life, we read this. Jesus says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." See what Jesus is saying? He's saying, I'm not just saying, tolerate your enemies. He's saying, love them. Don't just not destroy them. That's one thing, isn't it? Maybe most of us think, well, that's, kind of possible. But love them. That's a lot harder, isn't it? And yet Jesus says we should. But I guess the question is, it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to practice it, isn't it? The world is full of people who have taught great ideals, but whose life has not fulfilled or lived up to the ideals that they have taught. And yet, did Jesus fulfill this ideal? Well, actually, remarkably, he did. Because if you were to keep reading the story, you would see, actually, what does Jesus do? He doesn't go and kill his enemies, as his followers think he should. He dies at the hands of his enemies. And actually, he says that he dies for his enemies. And he shows his love for them in the most costly way possible. Jesus isn't just a great teacher who gives some nice ideals but doesn't meet up to them. He literally, to the point of death, is willing to live out that reality. So Jesus says, this is what truth looks like. It doesn't just destroy the enemy, it loves the enemy. And actually we see that. Let's just look at one other passage. This is during the account of Jesus' crucifixion. Listen to what happens here. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. So here is Jesus, stripped naked, crucified on a cross. And he says to the very people, about the very people who are doing that, God, Father, forgive them. So Jesus doesn't just say, love your enemies, but in the moment when he's being crucified by them, he loves them. And I kind of want to say, if that is the root, the center of what it means to follow Jesus, if this is who Jesus is, here's the question. Do you want someone to follow Jesus lightly or deeply, right? What would it look like to follow someone who says, not only don't destroy your enemies, but love your enemies? What would it look like to follow someone who offers forgiveness, not retribution? And I would suggest the answer in those situations is not to hold religion lightly, but actually to follow Jesus more deeply. And sadly, the reality through history is that there have been many people who have claimed the name of Jesus, but the problem is they haven't followed Jesus deeply. They haven't followed Jesus in this way. And therefore, I would suggest the answer is not to be less serious, but to be more serious about the Jesus they claim to follow. Okay? And that also just means that there's one other thing worth saying before we finish. And that is, forgiveness goes deeper than tolerance. I don't know about here, but certainly in the UK, there's a lot of talk about tolerance, particularly when it comes to religion. In fact, when people talk about British values, okay, no one's ever quite sure what they are. But apparently, a British value is tolerance. We talk a lot about it, okay? We should tolerate everyone. And in a sense, I agree. That is good. And I think one of the fruits of the teaching of Jesus on our world has been this idea of tolerance and religious tolerance. And by the way, tolerance also presupposes that you don't all believe the same thing, because if you all believe the same thing, then you wouldn't need tolerance. Tolerance presupposes that we disagree, and that's why we need it. But I'd also say that forgiveness is different to tolerance. The question is how. Let me give you a slightly embarrassing story. I used to work for a church in England, and there was a particular Sunday I'd been speaking at the church service, and I was talking to people as they were leaving. And there was this older lady who came up to me, and she said, "Michael, I don't think your clothes are very well ironed." And I was like, "Sorry?" She says, "Your clothes, they've not been very well ironed." And I was like, "Okay." I said, "Well, that's because they're not ironed. I don't actually do ironing, right? I hate the thing." So she says, "Well, I would like to do your ironing for you." So I said, "That's fine. Thank you very much. But no, thanks. I'm okay." So the next week she comes up and she says, "Michael, I really want to do your ironing for you." I said, "No, it's fine. It's fine." The next week she comes up, and eventually, after several weeks, I think the only way I can get her off my case is to let her do my ironing. Someone did suggest that I could have done it myself, but that didn't come into my mind. So we came up with this arrangement. I would wash my clothes, and then I would drive across town about 20 minutes. I would give her my washed but unironed clothes. I would drive home. A day or two later, I would drive back across town, collect my ironed clothes, and drive home. So I was taking 80 minutes of my week, each week, just delivering my clothes. I mean, it would have been quicker just to do my ironing. But anyway, this went on for a few weeks, a few months. Then one particular week, I was really busy. So I'd taken my clothes, but I didn't have time to pick them up. So she phoned me up and she said, "Well, don't worry. I will leave your clothes at church and you can collect them." So I said, "Oh, that's great." So the next day, I went to the church building and I tried to find my clothes. I couldn't find them. So I went downstairs and I spoke to the secretary who worked at the church and I said, "Have you seen my clothes? Barbara left my clothes yesterday." She says, "I haven't seen your clothes." So I phone her up and I say, "Look, what did you do with the clothes? I just can't find them." And she said, "I left them with Muriel." Now that doesn't mean anything to you guys, because you don't know yet that Muriel was a lady in our church who ran an outreach to people who were homeless, okay? And they used to meet on a Wednesday. This was Thursday. So I go downstairs and I say to Muriel, "Barbara left my clothes with you yesterday. Have you got them?" And there was this horrible moment when you could see the cogs in her brain starting to move. And then she realized what she had done. She had, in fact, given away all of my clothes to the homeless of my town. In fact, not all of the clothes. My pajamas and a t-shirt hadn't been given away. Obviously, even the homeless didn't want my pajamas. But anyway, everything else had been given away, literally all of my clothes. I am very upset. And I'm saying to her, "Why did you give away my clothes?" She says, "Well, it's not my fault. It is Barbara's fault. She shouldn't have given me your clothes. She knows I give away clothes. Wrong idea." So I phoned up Barbara. I said, "Barbara, why did you give Muriel my clothes?" She said, "It's Muriel's fault." She says, "She knew that they were for you. I told her she shouldn't have given them away." So Barbara blamed Muriel, Muriel blamed Barbara. And eventually I'm on the phone to Barbara. And she says, "Well, Michael, I'm sorry." And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is the point when I say, it's fine, it doesn't matter, forget it. And yet I couldn't, okay? Because I was so upset that all my clothes had been given away, I just couldn't say it was okay because it wasn't okay. So then I was thinking, what do I say? And I couldn't think of anything to say. I have to confess, I actually just put the phone down. But then I felt really bad because I thought, well, she did say that she was sorry, but I just didn't know what to say. So I phoned up my friend. I explained what happened. He found this very funny, just as you have found this funny tonight. And I said, what should I have said? She said that she was sorry. I felt I should say it was okay, but I couldn't say it was okay because it wasn't okay. What should I say? I'll never forget what he said. He said, if you were willing, you should have said, I forgive you. And for the first time in my life, I realized the difference between forgiveness and tolerance. Tolerance is when you say to someone, it's okay. And you can do that in some situations, but what if it's not okay? And by the way, giving away someone's clothes is not the biggest deal in the world. But there are things that are really not okay, aren't there? Do we just tolerate that? When you've been hurt by others? When those that you love have been hurt by others? And I would suggest you need more than tolerance. You need forgiveness. And actually, interestingly, Jesus doesn't ever talk about tolerating us. He does talk about forgiving us, as he does here. He doesn't tolerate the people who are crucifying him, but he does offer them forgiveness. That's so much deeper, isn't it? You know, when God looks at this world, he doesn't say it's all okay, because it's not okay, is it? We just have to look around us and see that a lot is not okay. And when God looks at my life and your life, he doesn't say it's okay, because actually, if we're really honest, there are things in all of our lives that are not okay. And perhaps we've all treated other people in a way that's been hurtful and wrong. But God does and is willing to do something bigger. He doesn't say it's okay. He does this. He says, it's not okay, but I'm not going to make you pay. If I was to forgive Barbara, I couldn't then give her a bill for clothes, okay? I was going to go out and buy the new ones. And in the same way, if God forgives us, he doesn't make us pay. In fact, that's the heart of what Jesus did. He died to pay himself, to take the consequence for the injustice, for the divisiveness, for the evil and the wrong of our worlds. And that is at the heart of what Jesus claims. Not just tolerance, forgiveness. And so I would suggest, what would really give us peace in a world of competing truth claims? What about a person whose truth claim is this? Love your enemies and forgive them. And that is what Jesus offers. And I guess before we go to your questions, let me just say and ask you, have you ever received that forgiveness yourself? That is ultimately what Jesus offers. That's at the heart of what he's offering. Forgiveness to everyone, because we're all in the same boat. Doesn't matter who we are. And he's willing to give it to us. But forgiveness has two parts, doesn't it? Forgiveness needs to be offered. It also needs to be received. The hard thing about receiving forgiveness is actually admitting that you need it, because that takes a degree of humility. But actually, if we're willing to say to God, actually, I need your forgiveness, not just everyone else, then God says that he's willing to give it to us. And when we experience God's forgiveness, Jesus also says that is the thing that enables us to forgive others in a way that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. When you know that there is a God who has forgiven you, that gives you the power and the resources to offer that to others. So if you've never received that forgiveness, then why not ask for it? Talk to this God, talk to Jesus and say, Jesus, help me to experience your forgiveness. Or maybe you've still got lots of questions. Well, we'll get to your questions in a moment. Maybe you're kind of intrigued by this, but you're not convinced. Let me just put up here, there's another QR code. This isn't for questions, okay? But this is, if you'd like to keep in touch, we would love to connect with you, because we're aware that these claims that we're talking about this week are really big. So why not fill out this feedback form online? And it would enable the group to basically connect, and they will let you know what is happening after these events have finished. And some of those things might be of real benefit to you. So scan that and fill that out. And if you're here and you're saying, actually, I'm really skeptical, I'm not even sure whether these claims about Jesus are true, how do we know that these are historically accurate? Again, ask your questions in a minute. We'd happily look at those. Also, there are books outside that are free to take away, including some of the first century biographical accounts of Jesus' life, including the one that I've been quoting from this evening. That would be a great place to start, especially if you're skeptical about this. Rather than just taking my word for this, go back to some of the best historical evidence and check it out for yourself. Okay, so there's loads of books outside. Welcome. But I am going to hand back to our hosts. And in a moment, we will go to your questions. I'll put the other QR code up so that you have that if you haven't already.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, Michael, thank you so much for that very helpful talk. We do have time now for questions, so please.
I need to
think, well, I can. Yeah. Great. Well, here we are. So do scan this and start sending in any questions. Very happy to take questions from the floor. So feel free to raise a hand. But also, if you prefer to ask anonymously, then here's your opportunity.
Feel free to ask in Arabic or Hebrew if you prefer. And also you can go and vote on the questions that have already been answered. There aren't any.
Should we take 2 minutes just for people to get a chance to phrase your questions, put them in, get voting?
Yes.
If you can't think of a question, ask the person next to you.
Great. Okay. Well, we have a runaway leader, 9 votes. Why is Christianity the best answer to this question?
Great. These are great questions, by the way. So we'll deal with as many as we can. As we said yesterday, if we can't deal with them all, I'm not running away at the end. So you can grab me outside over at Coke and we can talk more. Why is Christianity the best answer to this question? So as I said, what we want to do is look at the heart of the truth claim and ask what would it look like to live that out and to follow that kind of consistently. And what I'm trying to claim tonight is that actually if we look at Jesus, not only his teaching, but his life and his example, I think actually that gives us not only a man who makes exclusive truth claims, but a man who gives us the greatest model of love and forgiveness and tolerance. I, as I say, grew up in Leicester. I've got lots of friends who are from different religious backgrounds, and I've tried to, through conversation, through study, investigate the basis for other religious belief systems. And I honestly say, as I've looked at the founders of different religions, I don't find anyone comparable to Jesus, both in terms of the magnitude of the claims that he makes. So no one else is claiming to be the only way to God. In fact, as Jesus claimed elsewhere, to be God in human form. But at the same time, to do that with such welcome and love for others, and particularly for those who opposed him. As I said, he didn't just teach that, but he lived that out. And to be honest, as I've looked at other religious leaders, I don't find them comparable in that way. Now, that is not to say that people who follow other religions are all unloving or unforgiving and so on. But what I am saying is that if you look at the heart of the founder and what they said and did, I think there is something that is unique, that stands out when it comes to the person of Jesus, that does seem to be different. And when it says, why is Christianity the best answer? I have deliberately talked about Jesus as the person rather than Christianity as the system. Because if we're thinking about the history of the institution of the church, it hasn't always been a great answer. Because often it hasn't reflected consistently the Jesus that they claim to follow. And so my answer is not a system called Christianity. My answer would be a person called Jesus. And I think, honestly, if you put that side by side and look at the historical documents for Jesus alongside the historical documents for Muhammad or for any other religious leader, including other great prophets in the Bible, Jesus stands head and shoulders above the rest in a way that I don't think others do. Now, you may not agree with that. You may want to come back on that. But that would be my conviction, having looked at that. Okay?
Well, this next question touches on similar ideas.
Okay.
I mean, you've mentioned about how peace comes through knowing Jesus, but we know that there are things in the world that are good. So, I mean, are you suggesting that the only peace in this world is through Jesus Christ?
That's a really good question. I guess behind the question is the assumption, isn't it really arrogant to claim that the only way that we can possibly find peace is through Jesus? And isn't it possible for other people to work for peace and reconciliation? And again, experience would say, yes. Clearly, it isn't just people who follow Jesus that can work for peace and reconciliation in the world. Now, as a Christian, I would say, according to the Bible at least, God has put on our human heart a reflection of who he is and what he is like. We said yesterday that one of the claims in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, is that God created human beings in his image. And so therefore, part of humanity will strive for and long for that which is good. But we're also broken, according to the Bible, which means that part of us won't always do that. So there is an inherent human capacity to long for peace and justice and so on. And I think that comes from the fact that we are created in the image of a God of peace, of justice, and of love. Now, of course, as we said yesterday, if there is no God, and if we are just the accidental collocation of atoms, as a result of a mindless process that has come from nothing and going to nowhere, then why desire peace? Why think that some things are absolutely good and other things are not, and so on? Where do we get those things from? I think the story of the Bible makes better sense for why we have those desires and those convictions. Having said that, I also want to say, I think the Christian faith focused on Jesus does give us unique and powerful resources and motivation to work for peace. And even if we don't claim to follow Jesus, I'd also want to suggest that Jesus' teaching has been so revolutionary that he has impacted the world, so that even if we don't claim to follow him, our thinking is very much affected by him. And again, we thought about that last night in terms of human rights. Many people who are not Christian would claim that human rights finds its origin in this revolution that Jesus started. Now, you don't have to be a follower of Jesus to believe in human rights, but actually, a lot of our thinking has been shaped by that. And actually, our thinking about religious tolerance, I would suggest, in the world has been massively shaped by Jesus, even if we don't claim to follow Jesus ourselves. This has been so revolutionary that it has impacted the way that we think. But as I also said, the experience of God's forgiveness personally does help you do that. I was really struck, I was talking to someone about Nelson Mandela, because obviously the apartheid system in South Africa was such a horrific evil. And Mandela's response of forgiveness rather than revenge basically probably prevented South Africa falling into a civil war at the end of the apartheid system. And I was saying to someone, I said, I found it remarkable that Nelson Mandela, had such a strong emphasis on forgiveness, but he wasn't a Christian. And my friend said, well, he didn't publicly talk about his Christian faith, but actually he was massively influenced by Jesus and by Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, and certainly massively inspired by Jesus' teaching about forgiveness for your enemies. So although he maybe didn't publicly talk about him being a Christian, perhaps because he didn't want to be seen as being divisive, imposing Christianity upon the nation and so on, his idea of forgiveness was certainly rooted in the teaching of Jesus.
Just want to give an opportunity for anyone to raise a hand. Well, plenty more opportunities.
Okay.
So next question. We've got a couple here on eight votes. We'll take the one that happens to be highest at the moment.
Yeah.
What happens if I don't ask for Jesus' forgiveness? Isn't living a good life enough?
Yeah, it's a good question. So why do I need to ask for Jesus' forgiveness? Isn't living a good life enough? Well, in one sense, you could say yes. If you can live the perfectly good life, then of course you don't need forgiveness. The only thing is it's quite hard, isn't it? If you think, by the way, that you could, at least in theory, live the perfectly good life, my challenge to you is to do it tomorrow, okay? I reckon you'll do really well for about 7 or 8 hours. Then you'll have to wake up, and then it'll become a lot more difficult, okay? Because our problem is not so much that we don't know how we should live. Our problem is often that we don't live up even to our own expectations and standards, let alone God's, if there is a God's standards to live up to. Okay? And according to Jesus and according to the Christian faith, actually all of us have fallen short of that perfect standards. So if the requirement from God was to live the perfectly good life, we're all basically screwed. Okay? And yet Jesus says he hadn't come for people who were good enough, because no one is. He says he came for those who recognize that they weren't good enough. And that's why he offers forgiveness. And that is wonderfully good news, because none of us would be good enough for God. And actually, if God, I often say that, what do we long for? We long for a world where there is no division, no peace, perfect harmony, no injustice. And we can probably all think of lots of people that we could get rid of in the world that might make the world a better place. But if you wanted a world with no injustice, perfect harmony and complete peace, where would you stop when it comes to getting rid of people? Well, I think we'd also have to get rid of ourselves. Because if we're really honest, sometimes in our own relationships, at least, we can contribute to that, can't we? So if we want a world where there is perfect peace and harmony, yet we have to live up to that standards, we're all screwed. Jesus says actually what we need is forgiveness. A recognition that we aren't good enough. And then because we have realized that we need forgiveness, that does help us to extend that forgiveness to others as well.
Again, more opportunities. It's always welcome. Let's press on. Well, 8 votes. If I want to start following Jesus, where can I start doing this?
Yeah, great. So where does it start? Well, as I said, the offer that Jesus makes is an offer of forgiveness. And as I said, forgiveness can be offered, but it also needs to be received. And as I said, the difficult thing about receiving forgiveness is that you need to recognize that you need it. It requires saying sorry. And as someone once said, sorry is the hardest word. But if we are willing to say to this God, actually, I'm not good enough. I know that I have screwed up. Please forgive me. Then actually, what Jesus is willing to offer us is not just forgiveness, a clean slate, our past wrongs wiped clean, but also, as a result of that, we can then enjoy a relationship with God restored and made new. I was looking out the window earlier. You've got this balloon that goes up and down in Tel Aviv. And what do you call it? I don't know. Does it have a name? The big balloon that goes up and down on the cable? You've seen it, right? Yeah. The hot air balloon. The thing that, yeah. I was looking at that. Back in my town in England, we used to have one like that, and tourists would go up and down. And I was looking out the window one day, and I was kind of like, I was a bit bored. So it was up, it's down, it's up, it's down. And then I looked out the window and I was like, it's not up, it's not down. What's happened to us? And then I realized, well, for a second, I thought maybe the cable has snapped and like all those tourists have just like floated off into space. And then I realized what actually happened was, because it's England, you know, it became cloudy and the clouds come in. And so this balloon was now in the middle of the clouds and just couldn't see it. And I was thinking, clouds, they're like a barrier, aren't they? It was still there, but I couldn't see it. And in the same way, the Bible says our wrong, our sin, to use the word that the Bible uses, is like a cloud that separates us from God. And so we cannot feel his love and experience his friendship in the way that we are meant to. But Jesus' forgiveness is like the wind that blows that cloud away and restores the warmth of that friendship. And that is what it means to follow Jesus. It means to have a restored relationship with the God who loves you. And it is, as we said this week, about a relationship rather than a set of rules, and about getting to know this Jesus. But like all relationships, they have to start somewhere. But also, like relationships, they can grow and develop and grow even more wonderful over time. So I'd say start that relationship if you haven't already, and then seek to develop and grow that relationship.
Well, if people are out here wanting some kind of relationship, then it isn't important if we call it religion, as long as we're cultivating a relationship based on love.
Okay. Is it important to call it a religion as long as we cultivate a relationship? If you go back to the very first book in the Bible, the book of Genesis, it talks about how God created humanity, and it talks about how God created humanity for two types of relationships. We might say horizontal and vertical. Get it right. Relationships. And we're created to have relationships with each other. That's really important. We're also created to have a relationship and a connection with God. And we need both. One of the mistakes is to think that horizontal human relationships can fulfill our deepest and greatest needs. And ultimately, that is to put too much weight and expectation upon the needs, upon someone else to meet our needs. Because if we were created to find our ultimate satisfaction in connecting with the God of the universe, then no other human being is going to be big enough to do that. So it is absolutely right to cultivate and develop relationships with other human beings. And we can have all sorts of relationships, can't we? Not just spousal relationships, friendships, familial relationships, and so on. But actually, we also need a different kind of relationship, a relationship with God. And Jesus says that God is the source of love. And so if I'm connected to the source of love, that enables me to demonstrate that love to others. If I'm not connected to the source of love, then actually I'm going to seek to try and get from others what I can only ultimately try and find from God. So I have found following Jesus not only means that I get to enjoy a relationship with God because of Jesus and his forgiveness, I think it also means that God gives me the resources to love others in a way that I would struggle to do without him. It actually helps those horizontal relationships too. And to miss out on that, to just focus on my relationships with other human beings without the resources that Jesus wants to offer, it's going to be difficult, and it's never going to fulfill us in the way that we need.
We'll take a couple more questions, I think, at a time. So, yeah, please do keep voting. We're definitely not going to be able to get through all of these questions now. So, if you've seen one lower down, let's get answered then quick. But again, not necessarily final, but another chance to raise a hand. It's great. I mean, this is why we have the Slido. Happy days. So it looks like taking slightly step back. Let's say that I'm convinced truth is important and absolute. How do I know that Jesus is the truth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's one thing to say that there is such a thing as absolute truth. There's a whole different thing to say that Jesus is that truth. And yeah, there are lots of people in the world who would believe in absolute truth, but wouldn't necessarily believe that Jesus is the truth. We run an event in our hometown where we have Muslim-Christian dialogue, and we often discuss together about different claims. And one thing that unites us is that actually we all believe in absolute truth. Okay? Now, we don't believe that truth is they wouldn't all believe that necessarily Jesus is that truth, but we can have shared conviction in the idea of truth. And therefore, that leads to constructive discussion because of it. So where would you start then in terms of looking at that? Well, obviously Jesus claims to be the truth, but then anyone could claim that. I mean, I could claim that tonight, and you wouldn't necessarily believe it. The interesting thing about Jesus is he doesn't just make incredible claims about himself, and claims to be the way, the truth, the life, claims to be the embodiment of God, such that if you have encountered him, you have encountered God himself, and so on. But he also backs up those claims with incredible things that he did. He shows his authority. So if we read through the biographical accounts of Jesus, you see Jesus' authority over nature, over sickness, over evil, and ultimately over death itself through his resurrection. But that, by the way, is a massive claim, isn't it? And we're going to look at that tomorrow night in more detail. How can we take that historically seriously? We'll be thinking about that. So I would say Jesus doesn't just make claims that are of a magnitude that other religious leaders haven't, but he also then does things that others haven't, and we find it documented in a way that we can investigate, which potentially might lead us on to the question below. So maybe we'll go for that question below. The historical, is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, there was someone up there as well.
Okay. Did you see?
Oh, sorry, I had seen this one,
Yeah.
so I was thinking of answering this one. But then I just noticed there's this one as well. Should we deal with them both quickly? Finish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let me just take this one quickly. The historical accuracy of Jesus' life. So obviously when I make claims like, Jesus claimed to be God, he rose from the dead, one of the reactions that we can have to that is, but why should I assume that that is in any way true? Isn't that just a religious belief? And obviously it is a historical claim. And because it's a historical claim, it's a claim that we can investigate. Often when we look at religious systems are hard to investigate because they're in one sense not falsifiable. For instance, if I was to say, tomorrow morning, hey guys, last night I went to bed, I had a dream, I had a vision of God. In my vision, God told me X, Y, and Z, and now I'm telling you what God has told me. How would you know whether that's true? Well, in one sense, there's no way that you could show that it was false, right? Because it was my own experience, my own vision, and so on. You weren't there. So because it wasn't falsifiable, in one sense, you can't talk about it being verifiable either. It's based on an experience that one person has. And often religious claims can be like that. They're difficult to falsify. The heart of the Christian claim is that God revealed himself in human history at a certain point, in a certain place, very close to here, and you can check it out. And you can look at the historical evidence. And as one early Christian thinker said, this didn't happen in a corner. This is something that you can investigate for yourself. And so as we look at the historical sources, actually what I've found just increasingly compelling is just how much weight there is to them. Now, in one sense, this is also another talk for another day. Tomorrow night, we'll particularly look at that historical claim of Jesus' resurrection and look at some of the evidence for that, because that's such a big claim. It's worth spending a whole night on in more detail and how that connects to the topic of hope. But I would say, check it out. The nature of the claim invites investigation. And most of the people I meet who are very skeptical about it are not skeptical because they've looked at it in detail and have found it to be just insufficient. Often it's because they've just not actually looked at the historical evidence very much. And so that's why we're saying, please do that. It's a great place to start. But because there was another one that had more votes, just quickly on this one, every religion teaches love and respect to others. And how is Christianity different from other religions? Two things, I guess, to say on that. Firstly, when we say every religion, I mean, there are a lot of religions in the world, so I've got to be careful in saying, like, does every religion necessarily teach that? Certainly, it seems to be a common assumption, many people, that we should love and respect others. But I wouldn't want to say, definitely, every religion does say that we should do that. And as I said, that doesn't mean that people who follow that religion don't practice that, but is there a differentiation between the teaching and the practice? But I think I'd also say this. It's one thing to say you should love and respect others, but it's another thing to give you the capacity to do it. Jesus didn't just say, love your neighbor, he said, love your enemy. In that time, and still I would say to a degree today, that is pretty radical, isn't it? To love your enemy. And not only that, he offers forgiveness for his enemies and dies at the hands of them. And I would say that is not something you find in every religious system. Not just a general teaching about respect of others, but a command to love and to forgive that is backed up by practice. I'd say I think that is uniquely found in Jesus. And the experience of God's forgiveness, I think, is the greatest empowerment to forgive others. There was another question that came up but didn't get voted to the top, which is about forgiving terrorists. And forgiveness sounds really great, doesn't it? Until we actually have something to forgive. And then it feels a lot harder. I was talking to a guy a few years ago who was the chief superintendent of the police service in a particular part of England. And his son had become quite high in the police service himself. And they were sent to investigate a house where there were terrorists believed to be staying or plotting an incident. And in the time when they went and basically had to investigate, his son was stabbed to death by this terrorist. And I interviewed him in a public event, and he talked about how he would be willing to forgive his son's killers. And he talked about how Jesus' forgiveness of him had given him the power to be willing to forgive. And I was profoundly moved by that, because it's very easy to talk about forgiveness when we've got nothing too big to forgive. But to forgive when it's really costly. And his example of that, I thought was incredibly powerful. The other thing I would also say is this. Forgiveness, as I mentioned, with God has two parts, doesn't it? We need to receive God's forgiveness, and that means we need to recognize that we need it. It also works the same on a human level too. And Jesus says that we should be willing to forgive others if we follow him. But actually, if there is to be reconciliation, that forgiveness not only has to be offered, it also needs to be received. And therefore, there needs to be a recognition that what has been done is wrong. Sometimes people hear Jesus' teaching as, you should be reconciled to those who have deeply hurt you, despite the fact they have never said sorry. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. He is saying, don't seek revenge. You can let God, the judge, bring ultimate justice. And he is saying that you should be willing to forgive and to offer that. But actually, for forgiveness to be received, there needs to be a recognition that it needs to be needed. But sometimes the willingness to offer forgiveness can be the thing that also helps people to recognize that they need it. Because if there is no possibility of forgiveness, why would we ever own up to our failings? But if there is a God who forgives us and people who are willing to forgive us, maybe that helps us own our wrong and to face up to it in a different way. Thank you so much. These questions have been great. Well, there's more than we haven't looked at. So again, as I said, I'll be around. If my answers to your questions have provoked more questions, that often happens, really happy to talk about any of those. So I'll be outside or at the front at the end, and we can chat more about that.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you guys for coming. So as you said, you'll be outside, and there's some food outside and some books, so feel free to take what you want. We encourage you to come tomorrow. We're going to talk about hope, and bring your friends if you're interested. And that's it.
Thank you, Zoom people.
We need to open that.